The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Adirondack Mountains like a shroud as Detective Sarah Chen pulled her patrol car into the gravel parking lot of the Lake Placid Ranger Station. It was October 15th, 1987, and the autumn air carried the crisp scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from distant cabins. She had driven 3 hours from Albany after receiving the call that would haunt her for decades to come. 3 experienced hikers had vanished without a trace in the High Peaks wilderness, and a lone camper had stumbled upon something that defied explanation. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery that gripped the Adirondack region, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with this haunting tale. The missing hikers were the Kellerman family. Robert, a 45-year-old geology professor from Syracuse University, his wife Margaret, a 42-year-old high school biology teacher, and their 19-year-old son David, a sophomore studying environmental science at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. They were no strangers to the Adirondacks. Robert had been leading student field trips into these mountains for over 15 years. And the family had completed dozens of backcountry expeditions together. Their planned route was well within their capabilities. A 4-day trek along the Northville Placid Trail, starting from the Heart Lake parking area and ending at Lake Colden, with established lean-tos marking their intended campsites. Ranger Tom Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who had patrolled these woods since the Carter administration, met Detective Chen at the station's heavy wooden door. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee from a pot that had been brewing since dawn. "Never seen anything like it in 30 years up here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Kellermans were supposed to check in yesterday morning at the Lake Colden Ranger Station. When they didn't show, we figured maybe they'd decided to extend their trip. Happens all the time with experienced folks like them." The concern escalated when Robert's department secretary called the ranger station that evening. Robert had missed a crucial faculty meeting and hadn't called in, something entirely out of character for the meticulous professor. Margaret's school had also reported her absence without notification, and David's roommate at college confirmed he hadn't returned to his dorm as planned. By nightfall on October 14th, the Adirondack Park Agency had initiated a preliminary search protocol. Morrison led Detective Chen to a detailed topographical map spread across a scarred oak table. Red pins marked the Kellerman's intended route, while blue flags indicated where search teams had already covered ground. "Here's where it gets strange," Morrison said, pointing to a section of trail near Avalanche Lake. "We found their campsite from the first night, October 11th. Everything was normal. Fire ring properly extinguished, no trash left behind, lean-to swept clean. Classic Kellerman style, but then..." His finger moved to a spot roughly 8 miles northeast. "Nothing. It's like they just evaporated." The detective studied the map, noting the challenging terrain ahead of the family's last confirmed location. The trail wound through dense spruce and fir forests, past steep granite cliffs carved by glaciers millennia ago. In October, daylight hours were shortening rapidly, and temperatures could drop below freezing without warning. Even experienced hikers could find themselves in serious trouble if they took a wrong turn or suffered an injury. What troubled Morrison most was the discovery made by Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old software engineer from Boston who had been solo camping near Marcy Dam. Webb had contacted the ranger station at dawn, his voice shaking over the radio, as he reported finding something that made no sense. "He's waiting for us at the Marcy Dam ranger cabin," Morrison explained. "Wouldn't say much over the radio, but he sounded pretty shaken up. Been camping these mountains for years, and I've never heard him spooked like this." As they prepared to hike into the wilderness, Detective Chen couldn't shake the feeling that this case would challenge everything she thought she knew about missing persons investigations. The Adirondacks had swallowed people before. The vast wilderness stretched across 6 million acres, with countless ravines, caves, and hidden valleys where someone could disappear forever. But the Kellermans were different. They weren't reckless tourists or inexperienced day hikers. They knew these mountains like their own backyard, carried proper equipment, and followed established protocols that had kept them safe for decades. The October sun climbed higher as Chen and Morrison began their trek toward Marcy Dam, their boots crunching through frost-covered leaves that carpeted the trail. Neither spoke about their growing sense of dread, but both understood that Marcus Webb's discovery might hold the key to understanding how 3 experienced hikers had simply vanished into the ancient wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains. The trail to Marcy Dam wound through a cathedral of towering hemlocks and sugar maples, their canopy filtering the morning sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Detective Chen found herself studying every shadow, every break in the underbrush, as if the wilderness itself might reveal what had happened to the Kellerman family. Beside her, Ranger Morrison moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent 3 decades reading the subtle language of these mountains. They reached Marcy Dam after a 45-minute hike, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The wooden dam, built by loggers in the early 1900s, created a serene pond that reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. On any other day, Chen might have paused to appreciate the stunning beauty of this remote location. Today, however, her attention was focused entirely on the small ranger cabin where Marcus Webb waited. Webb emerged from the cabin as they approached, and Chen immediately noticed the man's haggard appearance. His usually neat brown hair was disheveled, his hands shook as he gripped a steaming mug of coffee, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. "Thank God you're here," he said, his Boston accent more pronounced than usual due to stress. "I've been going over it in my head all night, and it still doesn't make any sense." Morrison introduced Detective Chen, and Webb led them to a rough wooden table where he had spread out his camping gear and a detailed journal. "I've been coming up here for 12 years, Webb began, his voice steadying slightly. "Same routine every fall, solo backpacking trip before the snow flies. I know every trail, every lean-to, every water source within 20 miles of here." He opened his journal to a page dated October 13th. "I was camped at the Marcy Dam lean-to, planning to summit Mount Marcy the next morning. Around sunset, maybe 6:30, I heard voices coming from the trail that leads toward Avalanche Lake." Chen leaned forward, her detective instincts sharpening. "Could you make out what they were saying?" Webb shook his head. "Too far away, but it sounded like a family, man, woman, and what might have been a young adult. They seemed to be having a normal conversation, maybe discussing where to set up camp for the night. Nothing alarming." He paused, running his fingers through his hair. "That was the last time I heard human voices until this morning, when I radioed the ranger station." And Morrison consulted his map. The trail toward Avalanche Lake makes sense if they were following their planned route. Did you see them? "That's where it gets weird," Webb continued. "I was curious. You don't encounter many people this deep in the backcountry in mid-October, so I walked down toward the trail junction, maybe a quarter mile from my campsite. By the time I got there, the voices had stopped, but I could see fresh boot prints in the mud near the trail marker." He pointed to a spot on Morrison's map. 3 sets of prints heading northeast toward Avalanche Lake, just like you'd expect. Detective Chen made notes in her small pad. "What time did you check the trail?" "Just after 7 p.m. Still had maybe 30 minutes of usable daylight." Webb's expression grew troubled. "I figured they were experienced hikers who knew where they were going, so I headed back to my camp. Made dinner, wrote in my journal, went to sleep around 9:30. The morning of October 14th had dawned clear and cold," Webb explained. He broke camp early, intending to reach the summit of Mount Marcy by noon and return to his car before dark. The trail to Marcy's Peak branched off from the main Northville Placid Trail about 2 miles past the Avalanche Lake Junction, the same area where the mysterious family had been heading the previous evening. "I was making good time," Webb continued, "pushing hard because I wanted to beat some weather that was supposed to move in later. About 2 miles up the trail, I came to a small clearing where there's usually a nice view of the high peaks." He paused, his hands beginning to shake again. "That's where I found it." Morrison leaned forward. "Found what, Marcus?" Webb reached into his backpack and withdrew a clear plastic bag containing what appeared to be a torn piece of fabric. The material was a distinctive forest green color with orange trim, the kind of high-quality outdoor gear favored by serious hikers. This was hanging from a low branch about 8 feet off the ground, fresh tear, like it had just happened. Chen examined the fabric through the plastic bag. The material was indeed freshly torn, with no signs of weathering or fading that would indicate it had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. More importantly, the height at which it had been found suggested either someone very tall had passed through, or the fabric had been torn during some kind of struggle or unusual circumstance. "There's more," Webb said quietly. The ground around that tree was disturbed, not like animals had been digging, but like there had been some kind of commotion. Scuff marks in the dirt, a few broken branches at head height. He looked directly at Detective Chen. "But here's what really bothers me. I searched that entire area for an hour, looking for any other signs of the people I heard the night before. No more clothing, no equipment, no footprints leading away from the disturbance. It was like they had just vanished." The implications of Webb's discovery sent a chill through Detective Chen that had nothing to do with the October morning air. 3 experienced hikers, following a familiar trail, had apparently encountered something that caused enough of a disturbance to tear clothing and leave evidence of a struggle. Yet there were no signs of where they had gone after that encounter, no trail to follow, no additional clues to guide a search and rescue operation. Morrison studied his topographical map with growing concern. The area where Webb had made his discovery was surrounded by some of the most challenging terrain in the Adirondacks: steep ravines, dense forest, and countless places where someone could become lost or injured. But the Kellermans knew this country well. Robert had led student groups through this exact area multiple times, and the family had hiked these trails together for years. As the 3 men prepared to investigate Webb's discovery site firsthand, none could shake the growing certainty that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple hiking accident. The Adirondack wilderness had claimed many lives over the decades, but usually left clear evidence of what had occurred: bodies discovered years later in remote ravines, equipment scattered by weather and wildlife, obvious signs of where victims had strayed from established trails. The Kellerman family's disappearance was different. It suggested something sudden, unexpected, and thorough enough to leave virtually no trace of 3 adult human beings in one of the most heavily mapped wilderness areas in North America. The hike to Webb's discovery site took them deeper into the High Peaks wilderness, following a well-maintained trail that thousands of hikers used each year to access some of the Adirondacks' most spectacular summits. Detective Chen found herself constantly scanning the surrounding forest, looking for any sign that might have been missed during the initial search efforts. The October foliage created a stunning backdrop of reds, oranges, and yellows, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the beautiful wilderness was somehow concealing a dark secret. They reached the clearing Webb had described after 90 minutes of steady hiking. The area was exactly as the camper had reported, a small opening in the forest canopy that normally provided hikers with a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. Today, however, low-hanging clouds obscured the distant mountains, creating an atmosphere that felt both mysterious and ominous. Webb led them to the specific tree where he had discovered the torn fabric, pointing to the branch approximately 8 feet above the ground. Detective Chen examined the area carefully, noting the fresh scuff marks in the soil and several broken branches at roughly head height for an average adult. The disturbance pattern was unlike anything she had encountered in previous missing person cases. Too organized to be the result of animal activity, yet too chaotic to suggest a planned campsite or rest stop. Ranger Morrison began a systematic search of the surrounding area, his experienced eyes scanning for any additional evidence that might have been overlooked. "Marcus is right," he called out after several minutes of careful examination. "There are no clear footprints leading away from this spot in any direction. That's highly unusual. Even experienced hikers leave some kind of trail, especially in soil this soft." Detective Chen photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting the height and position of the torn fabric, the pattern of ground disturbance, and the broken vegetation. As she worked, she found herself developing a growing list of questions that challenged conventional search and rescue protocols. How does a family of 3 experienced hikers simply disappear from a well-traveled trail without leaving a clear path to follow? What could cause enough commotion to tear clothing and disturb the ground, yet leave no obvious signs of direction or destination? Webb watched nervously as the detective and ranger conducted their investigation. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I didn't mention back at the cabin because I wasn't sure if it was important." Chen looked up from her camera. "The night I heard those voices, October 13th, I was woken up around 3 in the morning by what sounded like someone calling for help. Very faint, like it was coming from far away, but definitely human." Morrison frowned. "Why didn't you investigate?" "I tried," Webb replied. "Got dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and spent about an hour hiking in the direction the sound seemed to be coming from. But you know how sound carries in these mountains at night. Could have been coming from miles away, or echoing off the cliffs in a way that made it seem like something else entirely." He paused. "By the time I got back to my campsite, everything was quiet again. I figured maybe it was just the wind, or my imagination playing tricks on me." The detective made careful notes about this additional information. Calls for help in the early morning hours of October 14th would align with a timeline where the Kellerman family had encountered trouble sometime after making camp on the evening of October 13th. But if Webb's estimate of the sound's distance was accurate, it suggested the family had traveled much further from the established trail than their experience level would normally indicate. As the investigation team prepared to expand their search beyond the immediate discovery site, Detective Chen couldn't ignore the growing complexity of the case. Every piece of evidence seemed to raise more questions than it answered, and the wilderness itself appeared to be actively concealing whatever had happened to the missing family. The Adirondacks had kept many secrets over the centuries, but few had been as puzzling or complete as the disappearance of Robert, Margaret, and David Kellerman. Morrison consulted his topographical map once again, this time focusing on the terrain beyond the discovery site. If they continued northeast from here, they would have been heading towards some pretty remote country, he said. Avalanche Lake is still a few miles away, but there are several unmarked trails and old logging roads that branch off in different directions. Most of them aren't maintained anymore and can be pretty treacherous, especially in low-light conditions. The search pattern would need to be expanded significantly, Chen realized. What had begun as a routine missing person case involving experienced hikers on a familiar trail was evolving into something far more complex and resource-intensive. The New York State Police would need to be contacted, additional search and rescue teams would need to be mobilized, and specialized equipment might be required to access some of the more remote areas where the family might have ended up. But even as she planned the logistics of an expanded search operation, Detective Chen couldn't shake the feeling that conventional search methods might not be sufficient. The Kellerman family's disappearance had too many unusual elements. The lack of a clear trail to follow, the height of the torn fabric, the complete absence of any additional evidence, despite an obvious disturbance at the discovery site. These factors suggested that whatever had happened to the family was not a typical hiking accident or case of getting lost in familiar territory. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the clearing, the search team faced a critical decision. They could return to headquarters and organize a large-scale search operation for the following day, or they could push deeper into the wilderness immediately, risking their own safety as daylight hours dwindled. The choice would prove to be more significant than any of them could have imagined. The decision to continue the search, despite the approaching darkness, came from Detective Chen herself. "If the Kellermans are injured somewhere out there, every hour could make the difference," she told Morrison and Webb as they stood in the clearing where the torn fabric had been discovered. "I've got enough emergency gear for an overnight if necessary, and Webb knows this terrain better than most people." Morrison nodded reluctantly. The veteran ranger understood the urgency, but also respected the dangers of the Adirondack wilderness after dark. "We stick together, we stay on established trails as much as possible, and we turn back at the first sign of weather," he said firmly. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes, no matter how good your intentions are." They decided to follow the most logical route the Kellerman family might have taken after leaving the discovery site. A faint but discernible path that led northeast toward Avalanche Lake. The trail was not officially maintained by the Department of Environmental Conservation, but it had been used by hikers and hunters for decades, creating a narrow corridor through the dense forest that was still passable for those who knew what to look for. Webb took the lead, his familiarity with the area proving invaluable as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain. The path wound through groves of ancient hemlocks, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces where very little sunlight reached the forest floor. Moss-covered fallen logs created natural bridges across small streams, and occasional clearings offered glimpses of the towering peaks that surrounded them. After 2 hours of careful hiking, they reached what Webb identified as an old logging camp from the 1940s. The site consisted of several collapsed wooden structures, rusted machinery partially reclaimed by the forest, and a large clearing that had been used as a staging area for timber operations. "This is where things get interesting," Webb said, pointing to clear evidence of recent human activity. A fire ring had been constructed from stones gathered around the clearing, and the ashes within appeared fresh, no more than a few days old. Nearby, they found flattened areas in the tall grass where sleeping bags or tents had obviously been placed, and a makeshift latrine had been dug at the edge of the forest using proper backcountry protocols. Most significantly, they discovered several footprints in a muddy area near a small spring that perfectly matched the boot sizes they would expect from the Kellerman family. "They were definitely here," Detective Chen said, photographing the evidence. "This looks like a planned campsite, not an emergency stop." She studied the layout of the camp carefully. Everything's organized, proper, leave-no-trace principles followed. Fire rings safely constructed away from vegetation. This is exactly what you'd expect from experienced hikers like the Kellermans. Morrison examined the fire ring more closely. "Ashes are cold, but not weathered. I'd say this fire was extinguished sometime yesterday, maybe early this morning at the latest." He looked around the clearing with growing puzzlement. But why would they camp here instead of continuing to one of the established lean-tos? This site isn't on any of their planned routes. Webb had been searching the perimeter of the clearing and called out from near the tree line. "Over here, I found something else." The others joined him at the edge of the forest, where he was crouched next to what appeared to be a hastily abandoned backpack. The pack was high-quality gear, the kind used by serious outdoor enthusiasts, and still contained most of its contents: sleeping bag, extra clothing, water purification tablets, and emergency food supplies. Detective Chen opened the pack carefully, looking for identification. Inside a waterproof document case, she found exactly what she was looking for: a driver's license belonging to David Kellerman, the 19-year-old college student. "This is definitely their campsite," she announced. But why would David abandon his pack? That goes against everything experienced hikers are taught about wilderness safety. The discovery of the abandoned backpack raised disturbing new questions about the family's disappearance. Experienced outdoors people simply do not abandon essential survival gear unless faced with immediate danger or emergency circumstances that require rapid movement. The pack's contents suggested it had been abandoned quickly rather than deliberately cached for later retrieval. Sleeping bags stuffed carelessly inside, clothing items not properly organized, water bottles still half full. As darkness began to settle over the abandoned logging camp, Morrison made the decision to establish their own campsite for the night. "We're not going to accomplish anything more stumbling around in the dark," he said. "First light tomorrow, we'll expand the search from this location." None of them spoke about the growing sense that they were following a trail that led deeper into mystery rather than toward answers. Webb worked efficiently to establish a safe camp, drawing on years of solo wilderness experience. Detective Chen used her satellite radio to contact headquarters, reporting their location and requesting additional search teams for the following morning. The conversation was brief and professional, but she could hear the concern in her supervisor's voice. Missing person cases in the Adirondacks rarely followed predictable patterns, and this one was already showing signs of unusual complexity. As they sat around their carefully contained campfire that night, each member of the search team struggled with the implications of what they had discovered. The Kellerman family had clearly made it much further into the wilderness than anyone had initially suspected, following routes that were not part of their original plan. They had established at least one organized campsite, suggesting they were not lost or in immediate distress. Yet something had compelled David to abandon essential survival gear, and all three family members had subsequently vanished without leaving any clear indication of where they had gone next. The October night was clear and cold, with temperatures dropping into the low 30s. Above the forest canopy, stars shone with the brilliant intensity only possible in areas far from artificial light pollution. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect night for wilderness camping. Tonight, however, the beauty of the Adirondack wilderness felt somehow ominous, as if the ancient mountains themselves were keeping secrets that might never be revealed. Detective Chen found sleep difficult despite her exhaustion. Every sound from the surrounding forest, the crack of a branch, the rustle of wind through dry leaves, the distant call of a loon from some hidden lake, seemed to carry the possibility of answers about the missing family. She had worked dozens of missing person cases during her career, but none had presented such a puzzling combination of evidence and absence of clear direction. Around 3 a.m, she was awakened by a sound that made her heart race, a human voice calling faintly from somewhere in the darkness beyond their campsite. The call was too distant and distorted to make out specific words, but it carried the unmistakable tone of someone in distress. Webb and Morrison were awake instantly, their wilderness experience making them naturally alert to any unusual sounds during the night. "That came from the northeast," Webb whispered, pointing toward the dense forest beyond the old logging camp. "Same direction the Kellermans would have been heading if they continued from this campsite." The three searchers listened intently for several minutes, but the sound was not repeated. Whatever or whoever had called out in the night had fallen silent again. The decision of whether to investigate immediately or wait for daylight would prove to be one of the most crucial moments in the entire search operation. Detective Chen felt every instinct telling her to grab her flashlight and head into the forest immediately. If one of the Kellermans was injured and calling for help, every minute of delay could be critical. But Morrison's wilderness experience argued for caution. Moving through unfamiliar forest at night, even with flashlights, carried significant risks of injury or becoming lost themselves. The sound came again, slightly clearer this time, and unmistakably human. It seemed to be coming from a greater distance than before, as if whoever was calling was moving away from their location. Webb was already reaching for his gear. "We have to investigate," he said quietly. "If that's one of the Kellermans, we might be their only chance." As dawn broke over the abandoned logging camp, Detective Chen, Ranger Morrison, and Marcus Webb prepared for what they sensed might be the final phase of their search for the missing Kellerman family. The mysterious calls in the night had come from somewhere deeper in the wilderness, beyond any established trails or known camping areas. Following the sounds would mean venturing into some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the entire Adirondack Park. Morrison consulted his most detailed topographical maps, comparing them with GPS coordinates taken during the night when they had heard the distress calls. "If my calculations are correct, those sounds were coming from somewhere near the old Tahawus mining area," he said. "That's about 8 miles northeast of here, through some pretty rough country. The mining operation shut down in the 1960s, but there are still old buildings and equipment scattered throughout that valley." Webb nodded grimly. "I've been up there a few times over the years. It's beautiful country, but definitely not somewhere you'd want to be if you were injured or lost. Lots of unstable terrain from the old mining operations, plus some deep ravines and rock falls that could trap someone easily." He paused, "but it would explain why we haven't been able to track them using conventional search methods. That area is so remote that most search teams never even consider it." Detective Chen made the decision to split their resources. Morrison would return to headquarters to organize a larger search and rescue operation focused on the Tahoe's area, while she and Webb would continue following the trail immediately. Time was becoming increasingly critical. If the Kellermans had been missing since October 13th, they had now been in the wilderness for 4 days with limited supplies and potentially serious injuries. The hike toward the old mining area took them through some of the most spectacular and challenging terrain in the Adirondacks. They followed abandoned logging roads for the first few miles, then transitioned to game trails and finally to unmarked paths that required constant navigation with map and compass. The October weather remained clear but cold, with frost covering the ground each morning and temperatures barely reaching 50 degrees during the day. After 6 hours of steady hiking, they reached the outskirts of what had once been the Tahawus mining operation. The area was a surreal mixture of industrial ruins and natural beauty, massive pieces of abandoned equipment slowly being reclaimed by the forest, concrete foundations cracked and split by decades of freeze-thaw cycles, and tailings piles that had created artificial hills covered with hardy plants adapted to the disturbed soil. Webb led them to a vantage point overlooking the main valley where most of the mining activity had taken place. If someone was lost or injured down there, they could easily be hidden among all those ruins, he said, and sound would carry strangely through the valley. Voices could seem to come from anywhere, depending on wind direction and echoes off the old buildings. Detective Chen used binoculars to scan the valley systematically, looking for any signs of recent human activity. The scale of the abandoned operation was much larger than she had expected. Dozens of buildings in various states of collapse, miles of access roads now overgrown with vegetation, and numerous mine openings that disappeared into the darkness of the surrounding hillsides. Searching such a vast and complex area thoroughly would require a team of dozens of people and potentially several days. But as she adjusted the focus on her binoculars to examine a cluster of buildings near the center of the valley, Detective Chen saw something that made her heart race. Smoke, a thin column of grey, rising from what appeared to be a chimney on one of the more intact structures. Someone was down there and they had managed to build a fire. "There," she said, handing the binoculars to Webb. "Center of the valley, the building with the red roof that's still mostly intact. There's definitely smoke coming from inside." Webb confirmed the sighting and quickly identified the most direct route down into the valley. The descent would be treacherous, requiring careful navigation through loose rock and unstable terrain, but it was manageable for experienced hikers. The approach to the smoking building took them nearly 2 hours, as they were forced to detour around several areas where old mine workings had created dangerous conditions. As they drew closer, they could see that someone had made recent repairs to the structure. Broken windows had been covered with plastic sheeting, gaps in the walls had been patched with pieces of wood and metal salvaged from other buildings, and a makeshift chimney had been constructed to safely vent smoke from what was obviously a heating and cooking fire inside. Detective Chen drew her service weapon as they approached the building, not knowing what they might encounter inside. The structure had originally been some kind of administrative office for the mining operation, with several rooms and what appeared to be a small kitchen area. Through one of the improvised windows, she could see the glow of firelight and shadows moving inside. "Hello," she called out in a clear, authoritative voice. "This is Detective Chen with the New York State Police. Is anyone inside?" The movement inside the building stopped immediately, followed by several moments of complete silence. Then a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Please, help us." The door to the building opened slowly, revealing a figure that Chen initially didn't recognize. The person was covered in dirt, wearing torn and stained clothing, and moving with the careful, deliberate motions of someone who had been injured. Only when the figure stepped fully into the daylight did she realize she was looking at David Kellerman, the 19-year-old college student who had been missing for 4 days. "David," she said, holstering her weapon and moving quickly toward the young man. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" David's response would provide the first real answers about what had happened to the Kellerman family, but it would also raise questions that would challenge everything the search team thought they understood about the case. "Mom's inside," David said, his voice hoarse from dehydration and exhaustion. "She's hurt pretty bad. Dad—" He paused, looking back toward the dark forest that surrounded the mining ruins. "Dad went to get help 3 days ago. He hasn't come back." Detective Chen felt a mixture of relief and renewed concern as she followed David Kellerman into the makeshift shelter. Inside, she found Margaret Kellerman lying on a sleeping bag near the fire, her left leg clearly broken and roughly splintered with pieces of wood and torn clothing. The woman was conscious, but obviously in significant pain, and she showed signs of dehydration and exposure, despite her son's efforts to care for her. "Mrs. Kellerman, I'm Detective Chen," she said, kneeling beside the injured woman. "We're here to get you out of this place and to a hospital. Can you tell me what happened to your family?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears of relief as she began to recount the events that had led to their disappearance. The story that emerged over the next hour would finally explain the mysterious circumstances surrounding the Kellerman family's vanishing, but it would also reveal the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary people will go to survive in the wilderness, and the tragic consequences that sometimes result from a single moment of bad luck in an unforgiving environment. On the evening of October 13th, the family had indeed made camp at the old logging site, where the search team had found David's abandoned backpack. Their original plan had been to continue to an established lean-to near Avalanche Lake, but Robert had been intrigued by some geological formations he had spotted from the trail, and they had decided to spend an extra day exploring the area around the old mining operation. The following morning, October 14th, they had hiked down into the Tahawoos Valley to investigate the abandoned buildings and mining equipment. Robert's professional interest in the geology of the area had led them to explore some of the old mine workings, and Margaret had been photographing the way nature was reclaiming the industrial ruins. It was during this exploration that disaster had struck. "We were examining one of the smaller mine openings," Margaret explained, her voice weak but determined to tell her story. Robert was explaining how the miners had followed a particular vein of ore into the hillside, and I was taking pictures of the entrance. David was collecting mineral samples from the tailings pile. She paused, closing her eyes against the memory. There was no warning. I heard a rumbling sound, and then suddenly the ground just gave way underneath me. Margaret had fallen approximately 15 feet into what appeared to be a secondary shaft or ventilation tunnel connected to the main mine workings. The fall had resulted in a compound fracture of her left tibia and fibula, along with numerous cuts and bruises from the rocky debris that had collapsed with her. More seriously, the fall had left her trapped in a space that was extremely difficult to access from above. "Robert and David spent hours trying to figure out how to get me out," she continued. "They lowered rope and tried different approaches, but the walls of the shaft were too unstable, and I was too badly injured to climb out on my own." The family had faced an agonizing decision. David could stay with his mother while Robert hiked out to get professional rescue help, or Robert could stay while David made the dangerous journey back to civilization. Robert Kellerman had made the choice that any experienced outdoorsman would make in similar circumstances. As the most experienced hiker and the one most familiar with the route back to the main trail system, he would make the emergency hike while David stayed to care for his mother. Using equipment from all three backpacks, they had managed to extract Margaret from the collapsed shaft and move her to the shelter of the abandoned building, where David could keep her warm and relatively safe while waiting for rescue. "Dad left early on the morning of October 15th, David added, his voice hollow with exhaustion and worry. "He took minimal gear, just water, emergency food, and his GPS unit. He said he would reach the ranger station by afternoon and have a rescue team back here by the next morning." The young man looked toward the forest where his father had disappeared 3 days earlier. "That was the last time we saw him." Detective Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October cold. Robert Kellerman had been missing for 3 days in wilderness that he knew well, following a route that should have been routine for someone with his experience. The fact that he had not returned with help and had not been found by any of the search teams suggested that something had gone seriously wrong during his emergency hike. Webb was already on his radio, calling for immediate medical evacuation for Margaret and requesting that search teams focus their efforts on the route Robert would have taken from the mining area back to the main trail system. The coordinates were transmitted to headquarters, and within an hour they could hear the sound of helicopters approaching through the mountain valleys. As they waited for the medical team to arrive, Detective Chen couldn't help but reflect on the tragic irony of the situation. The Kellerman family's disappearance had not been the result of getting lost, equipment failure, or inexperience in the wilderness. Instead, it had been caused by a simple accident, unstable ground around an abandoned mine shaft giving way at exactly the wrong moment. Everything that had followed, from the mysterious campsite to the torn fabric to the calls for help in the night, could be explained by the family's desperate efforts to survive and get help for Margaret's serious injuries. But the case was not yet closed. Robert Kellerman was still missing somewhere in the vast Adirondack wilderness, and finding him would require another search operation that might prove even more challenging than locating his wife and son. The experienced geology professor had vanished while following a route he knew well, carrying minimal gear, in a desperate race against time to save his wife's life. Whatever had happened to him during that journey would determine whether the Kellerman family's survival story would have a truly happy ending. The sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the Tahawus Valley marked the beginning of the end of one search, but also the start of another that would test the limits of what even the most experienced search and rescue teams could accomplish in the unforgiving wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains. The medical evacuation of Margaret Kellerman proceeded smoothly despite the challenging conditions at the abandoned mining site. The helicopter crew, experienced in mountain rescues, was able to stabilize her broken leg and get her to Albany Medical Center within 2 hours of the initial radio call. David accompanied his mother, exhausted but physically unharmed, after his 4-day ordeal, caring for her in the wilderness shelter he had created from salvaged materials and survival training his father had taught him over years of family hiking trips. But even as one crisis resolved, Detective Chen found herself facing an even more perplexing mystery. Robert Kellerman, a man who knew the Adirondack wilderness as well as anyone, had vanished completely while hiking a route that should have been routine for someone with his experience and knowledge. The search for the missing geology professor would require every resource the New York State Police and Adirondack Park Agency could mobilize. Ranger Morrison coordinated the expanded search from the ranger station at Lake Placid, bringing in specialized teams from across the region. Dog handlers arrived with bloodhounds trained to follow human scent trails. Technical rescue specialists prepared equipment for accessing difficult terrain, and helicopter crews began systematic aerial surveys of the most likely routes Robert might have taken from the mining area back to established trails. The search pattern was based on David's account of his father's intended route and timeline. Robert had planned to hike northeast from the Tahawus Valley, intersect with the Northville Placid Trail, and follow it back to Heart Lake, where their car was parked. From there, he would have driven directly to the ranger station to report the emergency and organize a rescue operation for his wife. The entire journey should have taken no more than 12 hours, even accounting for difficult terrain and the urgency of the situation. Detective Chen joined the ground search teams, focusing on the most direct route Robert would have taken during his emergency hike. The terrain was challenging, but not impossibly difficult for an experienced hiker. Dense forest, interspersed with rocky outcroppings, several stream crossings, and one significant elevation gain as the route passed over a saddle between two peaks. Weather conditions during Robert's hike had been good, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that would not have presented survival challenges for someone properly equipped. The first significant discovery came on the second day of the expanded search. A team searching near the intersection of Robert's probable route with the established trail system found his GPS unit lying beside a stream crossing. The device was undamaged and still functional, but its presence raised troubling questions about what had happened to the experienced hiker. "This doesn't make sense," Morrison said as he examined the GPS unit. Robert would never abandon his primary navigation tool voluntarily, especially during an emergency hike where getting lost could mean his wife's life. The device's memory showed that Robert had been making good progress along his intended route, with waypoints indicating he had covered nearly 2/3 of the distance back to the main trail system. Further search of the stream crossing area revealed scuff marks on the rocks and a few drops of what appeared to be dried blood on a fallen log. The evidence suggested that Robert had suffered some kind of accident at this location, perhaps a fall while crossing the swift-moving water, or an encounter with wildlife that had resulted in injury. But there were no clear indications of which direction he had gone after the incident, and no trail of blood or equipment to guide the search teams. Webb, who had remained with the search operation despite his exhaustion from the initial rescue, made a suggestion that would prove crucial. If Robert was injured and disoriented, he might not have continued toward the main trail, he said. "There's an old hunting cabin about 2 miles south of here, near Boreas Ponds. It's not marked on most maps, but local hunters have been using it for decades. If he was hurt and looking for shelter, that's where an experienced outdoorsman might go. The hunting cabin was located in an area that had not been included in the original search pattern, primarily because it would have represented a significant deviation from Robert's intended route. But if he had been injured at the stream crossing, the cabin would have been the closest source of potential shelter and supplies. Detective Chen organized a team to investigate the location immediately. The cabin was exactly as Webb had described, a small, weathered structure built decades earlier by local hunters and maintained through informal agreements among those who used it. As the search team approached, they could see that someone had been there recently. The door was slightly ajar, and there were fresh boot prints in the mud around the entrance. Inside, they found Robert Kellerman. The geology professor was alive but barely conscious, suffering from severe dehydration, a concussion, and what appeared to be a badly infected wound on his left arm. He had managed to reach the cabin 3 days earlier, but his injuries and deteriorating condition had prevented him from continuing his journey to get help for his wife. A makeshift first aid station constructed from supplies found in the cabin showed that he had attempted to treat his wounds, but infection and dehydration had left him too weak to travel further. "Margaret," were the first words Robert managed to whisper as Detective Chen knelt beside him. Did you find her?" The relief in his eyes when Chen assured him that both his wife and son were safe and receiving medical care was one of the most emotional moments in her entire law enforcement career. Robert's rescue required another helicopter evacuation, this time to the same Albany hospital, where Margaret was recovering from surgery to repair her broken leg. The reunion of the Kellerman family, after 5 days of separation under the most harrowing circumstances imaginable, marked the successful conclusion of one of the most complex search and rescue operations in recent Adirondack history. But the case also served as a sobering reminder of how quickly experienced hikers can find themselves in life-threatening situations, even in familiar wilderness areas. A single moment of unstable ground, one unfortunate step at a stream crossing, and a family's routine hiking trip had become a desperate struggle for survival that tested every skill they had learned during years of outdoor adventures. In the weeks that followed, as the Kellerman family recovered from their physical and emotional injuries, Detective Chen found herself reflecting on the lessons learned from their disappearance. The Adirondack wilderness demanded respect from everyone who ventured into its remote areas, regardless of experience level or familiarity with the terrain. Nature's power to transform routine activities into life-or-death situations served as a constant reminder that survival often depended as much on luck as on skill. The abandoned mining area where Margaret had fallen was subsequently marked with warning signs and barriers to prevent similar accidents. The old hunting cabin that had likely saved Robert's life was stocked with additional emergency supplies through a cooperative effort between local hunting groups and park authorities. And the story of the Kellerman family's survival became part of the oral tradition of the Adirondacks, a reminder that even the most experienced outdoor enthusiasts must always be prepared for the unexpected challenges that wilderness travel can present. Marcus Webb continued his annual solo camping trips to the High Peaks region, but he never again passed the area near Marcy Dam without remembering the morning he had discovered torn fabric hanging from a tree branch and begun the search that would lead to one of the most remarkable survival stories in Adirondack history. The mountains had tested the Kellerman family severely, but they had also revealed the incredible strength that ordinary people can find when faced with extraordinary circumstances. As winter settled over the peaks and valleys of the Adirondack Park, the wilderness that had nearly claimed 3 lives returned to its ancient rhythm of snow and silence. The story of their disappearance and miraculous rescue would be told and retold around campfires and in ranger stations for years to come, a testament to the power of both human determination and the unforgiving beauty of one of America's last great wilderness areas. The case officially closed, with all three family members recovered alive. But Detective Chen knew that the memory of those 5 desperate days would stay with the Kellermans forever. They had faced the ultimate test of their wilderness skills and family bonds, and they had survived through a combination of preparation, determination, and the kind of luck that reminds everyone who ventures into wild places that nature always has the final word.